In the summer of 1993, the dense forests of Hollow Creek, Montana, held a kind of quiet only nature could whisper. It was the start of the Boy Scouts' annual survival camp, a local tradition that turned young boys into confident outdoorsmen. Among the participants were Ethan Miller, 13, and Caleb Rourke, 12. Best friends since kindergarten, inseparable, and always the first to volunteer for adventure. Their troop had set up camp near an old logging trail that twisted deep into the woods. The area was said to have been used decades earlier by smugglers, but those were just campfire tales the older scouts told to keep the younger ones in line. On the third night, after dinner and songs around the fire, the troop leader noticed the boys hadn't returned from fetching water by the creek. Flashlights flickered through the trees, calling out their names, Ethan, Caleb. But the night answered only with the chirping of crickets and the rustle of unseen things moving. When morning came, the forest stood still, almost waiting. There were no footprints leading out, no torn clothing, no sign of a struggle, just their canteens lying by a rock, as if placed there carefully. By day 3, local police and volunteers flooded the woods. Search dogs lost the scent less than a mile from camp. The forest seemed to swallow the trail whole. Parents wept, scouts were sent home, and Hollow Creek, a town of 3,000, would never again hold a peaceful summer. Weeks turned into months. Posters of Ethan and Caleb fluttered on telephone poles, fading under sun and rain. FBI agents joined the case after early leads hinted at possible abduction, but with no ransom, no vehicle tracks, and no suspects, the theory collapsed under its own weight. Search parties found a single torn page from a scout manual, caught in a branch. Forensic experts could only confirm that the page likely belonged to the troop, but nothing tied it directly to the missing boys. The forest's reputation began to rot. Locals called it the Swallow Woods, where people entered but never came back. Families moved away. The Boy Scout chapter was quietly disbanded. Then came a chilling rumor. A hunter claimed to have seen 2 boys, dressed in old uniforms, deep in the woods near Hollow Creek Ridge. Their faces pale, their clothes pristine despite the passing years. The hunter swore he tried to follow, but they moved like fog and vanished between the trees. Sheriff Linda Harlan, who took over the cold case in 1998, dismissed the story as a trick of the mind, until she went back to the original crime scene and found something odd, a half-buried metal hook near where the boys' canteens had been found. It wasn't from scout gear. It was industrial. She ordered a partial excavation of the creekside area. That's when they found something metallic buried deeper, but the mud was too thick to dig further without equipment. The discovery was quietly logged, sealed in case files, and forgotten, until 15 years later, when a team of FBI forensic divers returned for an unrelated operation and stumbled across the exact coordinates. In 2008, while scanning for illegal waste dumps in the Hollow Creek region, an FBI environmental unit detected anomalous metal readings beneath the forest floor, rectangular, heavy, sealed. When the team unearthed the object, it wasn't a drum. It was a military-grade storage container, bolted shut, wrapped in vines and roots as if the forest had been hiding it. Inside, investigators expected hazardous waste. What they found instead left them speechless. There were Boy Scout uniforms, folded neatly and preserved in airtight condition. Beside them, a water-stained photograph of Ethan and Caleb, smiling beside a campfire, but behind them stood a man no one recognized, older, wearing the same scout uniform with no troop badge. There were also audio cassettes, each labeled only with a date. The first one read, July 14, 1993, Orientation. The FBI transferred the items to their evidence lab in Billings, Montana. When they played the first tape, they heard the familiar chatter of boys laughing, splashing water, and setting up camp. Then, halfway through the recording, a man's voice said calmly, "Don't worry, boys. It's just a test. The forest keeps secrets if you listen close enough." The tape ended with static. When the second tape was played, the laughter was gone. There were only footsteps, breathing, and a single whispered phrase from one boy, He said, "We'll see what's beneath the trees." Through analysis, the FBI determined the man's voice on the tapes belonged to a former scoutmaster named Walter Briggs, who had led camps in the 1970s but disappeared after being accused of misconduct. Officially, he was declared dead in 1985. Old archives revealed Briggs had a fascination with survival experiments, teaching boys to live in isolation, sometimes abandoning them overnight to test courage. Several scouts from those years later spoke of being locked in makeshift underground shelters as training. Ethan's father, Tom Miller, was brought in to identify the photo. He confirmed that neither his son nor Caleb knew Briggs, meaning someone had recreated Briggs's old methods years after his disappearance. But here was the puzzle. Briggs couldn't have been there in 1993. He'd supposedly died 8 years earlier. Unless someone had continued his methods. One of the tapes held background noises, faint machinery, a generator, dripping water. The acoustics suggested an underground structure. FBI excavation teams returned to Hollow Creek, guided by sound triangulation from the tapes. They uncovered a collapsed tunnel system, likely built during Prohibition for hiding bootleg alcohol, and within one chamber, pieces of scout gear, lanterns, and a carved wooden sign that read, "Troop 47, Courage Through Isolation." There were also initials scratched into the wall. EM and CR. The final tape was labeled Day 4. When it was played, the agents sat in silence. The boys' voices were weaker, confused. They talked about following instructions, and then Ethan said, "He told us to wait for the lights." Minutes later, the man's voice returned, whispering something unintelligible, followed by a sound like metal scraping and the boys crying out. Then silence. Forensic analysis of the recording showed low-frequency rumbling, suggesting collapsing earth, possibly the tunnel caving in. When the FBI compared the sound timeline to seismic activity reports from July 1993, they found a match, a small underground tremor recorded exactly the night the boys vanished. It wasn't a kidnapping. It was an unauthorized survival experiment gone catastrophically wrong. The man in the tapes, if it was indeed Briggs or a copycat, had trapped the boys in one of the tunnels during a test. When it collapsed, the forest buried everything, the structure, the truth, and the lives of 2 children. The buried container found in 2008 had been placed later, possibly by whoever survived, to preserve what happened or to silence it. But the strangest part came when an analyst enhanced the last seconds of the final tape. There was one last whisper, faint but clear. "They're still here." The discovery reopened the Hollow Creek case. Memorials were rebuilt, and the story became national news for weeks. But the FBI never identified who buried the container or how it remained intact for 15 years. Locals began reporting new sightings, a pair of boys seen at dusk near the old camp trail, always walking side by side, always disappearing when called to. Some said it was just guilt manifesting as ghosts. Others swore the forest was reclaiming what it once lost. Sheriff Linda Harlan retired in 2010, leaving a single note in the official file. "Some secrets don't want to be solved, they just want to be heard." And deep in the Hollow Creek woods, where the pines sway in the wind, hikers still say if you pause long enough, you can hear a faint crackle of static, and 2 young voices whispering, "We're not lost. We're home." Decades later, the case of the 2 vanished Boy Scouts remains one of the most unsettling mysteries in Montana's history. The official record lists it as a tragic accident, an unauthorized wilderness exercise that went fatally wrong. But the locals of Hollow Creek will tell you something different. They'll tell you that the forest has a voice. That on quiet nights, when the air is still and the moonlight hits the old trail just right, you can hear footsteps, 2 pairs, moving in perfect rhythm, laughing softly before fading into the dark. Some believe the boys' spirits linger, not lost but guarding the truth that was buried with them. Others think the woods simply remember, repeating echoes of what it once witnessed. Whatever you choose to believe, one thing remains certain. The forest never forgets.